Chapter 9 Amba Alage. Pietro Toselli was 17 years old when he graduated from the Accademia Reale in Turin as a sottotenente, the first rung on the officer's ladder of military rank. The Accademia, one of Italy's top military training institutes, normally didn't even admit students under the age of 16, but Toselli had shown unusual promise. He tore through the 3-year curriculum for artillerymen, finishing in 1878. Toselli opted for additional training in military engineering, and within 2 years he had ratcheted himself to the rank of first lieutenant. Then his career stalled. After such an auspicious beginning, Toselli had only one promotion in the next 8 years. Toselli had a nervous temperament, and by disposition he favored action, so he became restless. The Italian occupation of Massawa in 1885 reconfigured his options. Toselli began to see colonial service as an outlet for thwarted ambition, the answer to a stalled career, and he asked to be assigned overseas. In 1888, he set foot in Massawa, ready to make his career as a colonial officer. Toselli endeared himself to his men, his quote-unquote golden boys, as he called them. He greeted them with "Buonasera," good evening, in dialect at all the times of the day, including sunrise. His personality, that of a gentlemanly, quirky but highly competent senior officer, comes through in photos. They show him striking an exaggerated pose, the chain on his watch dangling from his jacket pocket, but it is clear that he delights in the company of his fellow soldiers. Toselli flourished in Eritrea. The colonial environment provided an outlet for energies and abilities that simply wasn't available elsewhere. It also paid well. Toselli rose rapidly in the ranks, from lieutenant to captain to major in just a few years. He credited his rise to his quote-unquote stubborn star and his hard work. He reveled in a setting where a glorious future beckoned, but he was discouraged by the overwhelming indifference of Italian public opinion to the call of empire and the sacrifices the army was making in its behalf. He wondered whether, in years to come, when northern Ethiopia had been Italianized despite popular apathy, anyone would remember or express gratitude for his sleepless nights and tormented days. By the early 1890s, Toselli was back in Italy, sharing the dream of an Italianized East Africa with anyone who would listen, but he remained frustrated in his ambition to arouse a spirit of conquest in the Italian people. He became an evangelist for colonial expansion, seeing in his own experience vigorous adventure, practical engagement, rapid advancement, a model for what empire could mean for Italy as a whole. Reaching back and conjuring an image of Italy's past, he adopted a simple pseudonym, Un Eritero, and wrote a book whose 3-word Latin title served as a stirring call to the Italian people to recover the lost glories of imperial Rome. Toselli's Pro Africa Italica not only advocated the development of Italian Africa, but also invoked the memory of Scipio Africanus, the pacifier of the Carthaginians and founder of Italica, a colonial settlement in southern Spain. Toselli would be a modern Scipio. Back in Africa, Toselli played a key role in defeating Mangasha in 1895. At the urging of General Arimondi, a demanding and mercurial personality, Toselli and his men had pursued Mangasha, taking advantage of his humiliating routes at Kwatit and Sanafe to push deep into Ethiopian territory. The rapid and exceedingly dangerous expansion of Italian rule had been the work of Pietro Toselli as much as anyone. Following the route of Mangesha, Toselli had proposed pushing south with the intent of destabilizing Menelik's rule. Many Europeans imagined Ethiopians, especially in the north, and Tigray, as seething in resentment of Menelik's rule. The mere appearance of an alternative to Menelik would prompt a rebellion. Menelik's empire would collapse in the wake of a bold advance as local rulers peeled away. Toselli was one of those who believed that the Italian presence would encourage rebels among local chieftains, starting with the Muslim leader Sheikh Thala. Upon moving as south as AMBW, however, Toselli found that the Italian presence made little difference. Sheikh Thala joined him with a few hundred men, but as a rule, the local population proved indifferent, even hostile in the face of the Italian presence. Toselli's forward position in the path of Menelik's advance was thus the result of his own initiative. The Ethiopian Amba is a mesa or plateau, an elevated area of land that is flat or nearly so, with sides that are steep and cliff-like. For Major Pietro Toselli and his 2,000 men, AMBW was an excellent choice for an advanced position. AMBW is a natural fortress that rises about 10,000 feet above sea level, a monster block of granite that towers over the surrounding countryside. It sits at a choke point on one of the main roads linking south and north Shawa and Tigray, Addis and Adigrat. The steep approaches to AMBW. Today, the highway through the pass has nearly a dozen switchbacks, give great advantages to the defender, as attackers must endure enemy fire and fatigue in any assault. Nearly a year had passed since Mangesha's defeat and Toselli's mad southward dash, but no one had clarified what Toselli's role would be when Menelik got around to mobilizing his response. Once his soldiers were in place, Toselli's mission was unclear. Engage, delay, or simply observe. Communications with General Arimondi, his commanding officer, 35 miles to the north, were iffy in a part of the country where the population was unsure, to say the least, about the Italian occupation. Peasants doubled as insurgents, waylaying messengers and intercepting messages. Communications sputtered. Even worse, bitter personal differences intruded. Months earlier, relations between Toselli and Arimondi had reached the point where they communicated only when professional obligation compelled them. In April, Toselli wrote home that he and Arimondi had broken with each other. Siamo in rotta, he wrote. By July, they were no longer even on speaking terms. Even so, Toselli remained confident. Quote, I don't enjoy his goodwill no matter. I will do my duty. Unquote. Toselli's determined optimism had to overcome more than Arimondi's hostility. Toselli's force of 2,000 was minuscule compared to the size of the force that Menelik had organized. In fact, it was far from obvious that Ethiopia needed to quote-unquote win back AMBW at all. Menelik, had he wished to do so, simply could have marched his army of 100,000 past Toselli and AMBW. Bypassed and cut off from his lines of reinforcement, Toselli's force would wither and die. AMBW would simply cease to matter. But AMBW would fulfill other objectives for Menelik, notably to test Mekonnen and his men by putting him at the head of an Ethiopian attack on AMBW. At court, Ethiopia was the core of an anti-European faction that doubted or pretended to doubt the loyalty of Ras Mekonnen, Ethiopia's noted Europhile. Tied to her brother Ras Wele, Mengesha and Alula, in effect, those from Tigray in the north, had no illusions about European intentions. As Tigrayans, they had witnessed the steady southward encroachment of Italy. Makonnen, however, had a distinct admiration for Europe and things Italian. He had led Menelik's delegation to Italy in 1889 and toured the country, reveling in the glories of Milan, Naples, Venice, and Rome. In his capacity as Menelik's viceroy at Harar in the Ethiopian south, he had developed cordial relationships with the community of European merchants and traders there. In the event of Menelik's untimely death, Makonnen would be a clear contender for the succession, an eventuality the ambitious Taitu undoubtedly had pondered. There were even rumors that Makonnen might be a pawn, an Italian ally in a divide-and-conquer strategy. All the more reason to put Makonnen at the head of the advance guard. There he would be the first to shed Italian blood. His men would be the first to fall. If Makonnen's loyalties were in doubt, what better test than to pit him and his men against the Italians? Cruel awakening. Makonnen's arrival at AMBW was an eye-opener for the Italians. It was the first time that the Italians could see with their own eyes the monster they had conjured. Although some commentators argued otherwise, the dominant view expressed in Italian military and journalistic circles was that Menelik could raise a force only in the tens of thousands, perhaps no more than 30,000. In April 1895, Italian intelligence in Addis was reporting 2 Ethiopian columns of 12,000 each. Other rumors had it that Taitu had stayed behind in Addis, that troops had been diverted to Gojam to put down a rebellion by Takla Haimanot, that Makonnen alone was marching northward with a few thousand soldiers. These were rumors that the Italians were only too happy to believe. Similarly, it was argued that Menelik's support was insecure, that one or more of his allies, Alula, Mengesha, Taklahaimanot, Makonnen, would betray him at a critical moment. Such a presumption was not entirely wishful thinking. Menelik himself had proven an untrustworthy ally of Johannes, although he owed him his loyalty, would in turn be betrayed by untrustworthy subordinates. It wasn't unreasonable to think that Menelik would prefer to negotiate rather than test his army or the loyalty of his lieutenants. History was on the side of such arguments. Menelik had declared himself King of Kings in 1889. Twice since then, the Italians had entered northern Ethiopia, in January 1890 and in December 1894, and Menelik hadn't moved. This was what lay behind Toseli's dismissive remark that Menelik was a myth. But Menelik had his reasons. He was still ostensibly an ally of the Italians in 1890, when they occupied part of Tigray and invited him to Aksum to celebrate his solemn coronation. Wisely, he declined the invitation. To have accepted would have forever branded him a pawn of Italy. In 1894, the Italian entry into Adwa occurred in the context of the war with Mengesha, which did important work for Menelik by driving Mengesha into his arms. But it hardly required his presence and was over in a few days. Things were different in 1895. Mengesha, Alula, and the other restless northerners had long since rallied to Menelik's side as the only possible defender of Ethiopia. By forming his massive army and marching it against the Italians, his erstwhile patrons, Menelik could only affirm his independence and his right to the imperial title. Toseli personally expected to face a very modest force. As recently as July, he had anticipated a force of no more than 4,500, possibly led by Mengesha, whom the Italians had defeated, or perhaps was Rasuele. In a cruel awakening, Toseli and his men watched in awe from the heights of Ambalage as Makonnen's forces, nearly 40,000 strong, streamed over the passes into the valley opposite. In an instant, the situation confronting Italy changed radically. Toselli wrote in disbelief to Arimondi, "Sono molti, molti. There are many, many." And it was only Minilik's advance guard. On December 5th, Makonnen appealed to Toselli to evacuate his position. "I have come to make war," he wrote. "Friendship for Italian commander-in-chief Baratieri leads me to serve as a peacemaker." Makonnen even suggested he was being driven forward by Menelik almost against his will. "I must advance because the emperor is at Lake Ashenge, some 25 miles to the south, and when I stop his road is blocked. Toselli would have to get out of the way." Toselli understood the weakness of his position. If Makonnen attacked, Toselli and his men would die. Instead, Toselli appealed to Makonnen's self-interest, underlining the potential cost of war to Makonnen's ambitions. "To advance means war," replied Toselli, "the consequences of which no one can predict." Toselli hinted that defeat for Ethiopia might yet create an opening for Makonnen. "Consider that Magdala and Sahati determined the fate of two great Ethiopian emperors," he wrote, alluding to the defeats of Tewodros and Mangasha. Then, in an allusion to Makonnen's close relationship with Italy dating back to his visit in 1889, he added, "Today you would destroy your work of 7 years." Toselli's bravado aimed to raise doubts in Makonnen and to play on Makonnen's presumed imperial ambitions, but privately Toselli and his men had plenty of doubts of their own. Luigi Canovetti, a sweet and gentle native of Florence, wrote an unsparingly candid analysis of their situation to his sister Maria. Although he wrote with affection, signing with his nickname Gigi, he barely concealed the gravity of the moment. "We are 1,000 against 20,000, he wrote, undercounting both Makonnen's forces and his own. "Our names will be written in history books," he noted presciently. "What better reward can there be?" Toselli could retreat or he could be reinforced, but he refused to give up such a strong position without explicit instructions to do so. "The situation is graver than we thought. There are at least 30,000 of them," he wrote to General Arimondi, his commanding officer. "I await your reinforcements." Although Toselli didn't know it, General Arimondi had already ordered Toselli's retreat. Toselli never received the orders. That evening in his tent, Toselli scratched out a final note to Arimondi, a note that expressed his awe in the face of the vast Ethiopian encampment, along with his deep private misgivings. "Tonight the enemy has put on a magical spectacle of lights. The camp is bigger than Mangasha's camp at Kwatit, and Toselli commanded a much smaller force than the one Baratieri had led at Kwatit. It may be possible to gain a few days for the defense of the colony, but we cannot resolve the situation, and it will be necessary to pull back in order to prepare a counteroffensive and a large-scale war." He closed with the hope that reinforcements would arrive at any moment. "Is everything prepared? Are many troops on the way?" It was Toselli's final letter. All day on the 6th, the Ethiopians prepared for battle. That afternoon, about 4 o'clock, Toselli received a final communication from Arimondi. A column of 6 companies and 2 artillery batteries were on their way south, having left that morning. Toselli was encouraged by the news. At a distance of about 35 miles, reinforcements likely would arrive sometime the next day, or the 7th. On the 7th, the ambiguity in Arimondi's letter would prove fatal. He was only pushing these forces forward to cover Toselli's retreat. He had no intention of sending reinforcements all the way to Amba Alage. The next morning, December 7th, Makonnen's forces began their attack with rifle fire on advanced positions at 6:30. It was an attack that would build over the course of the morning, probing for weakness. Makonnen knew exactly where to test for fractures. The core of the Italian position consisted of the 4th Battalion, 1,300 askari led by Italian officers and supported by 2 artillery groups. The local chieftains, Ras Sabhat and Sheikh Tala, Ethiopians with grievances against Mangasha in Ras Sabhat's case, or Minilik in Tala's case, had sided with the Italians. Each added some 350 men to Tosali's force. Under the weight of Makonnen's attack, they and their men would feel acutely the gravity of the choice they had made. If they wavered, the Italian position would crumble. Thus, Makonnen focused his initial attacks on Tosali's uncertain allies. Tosali chose to protect his core forces, arraying his disciplined askari companies around Ambalage and putting Sapat and Tala on the periphery. Sapat was posted on the Italian left, perched on high ground above the main road leading around Ambalage to the north. If Sapat gave way, Makonnen's forces could turn the Italian left and begin the encirclement of Tosali's position. Tosali positioned 2 companies in support of Sapat. On the right, some 400 men loyal to Sheikh Tala occupied a position analogous to the Ras Sabhat on the left. They covered the road that bypassed Ambalage to the west, leading to Togora. Their role was to prevent a turning movement that threatened an alternative path of retreat. They were backed by indigenous Eritrean recruits commanded by Lieutenant Volpisali. Tosali, his 4 artillery pieces, and his reserve occupied the central position, the Amba itself. Pathways connecting the Italian left and right were precarious. In some places, the paths were little more than goat trails in hillsides or along ridges above the precipitous drops. Makonnen chose his attack carefully. At 7 in the morning, he sent a small force against the Italian right. It was easily repulsed. Makonnen then directed Raswele to lead his 7,000 men to test Sapat's position on the Italian left. Despite Sapat's dominant position, the disparity in numbers proved overwhelming. The resolve of Sapat's men, built on animosity toward Mangasha, wavered as thousands of their countrymen advanced. Within 2 hours, Sapat's forces were giving way. Tosali sent a company from his reserve in support, repulsing 3 renewed assaults. By 9 o'clock, Ras Makonnen was directing forces against the Italian center. Some 15,000 men advanced with high ground on either side. Terrain funneled them in front of Tosali's position, putting compact masses of men in front of disciplined artillery men. Italian guns were capable of firing both shells and shrapnel, typically fused to explode in the air. Shrapnel consisted of artillery shells packed with balls that were a fraction of an inch in diameter. Exploding in the air, the shell containing them rained down death of yards around, wounding dozens in a single brilliant flash. When it was fired into hard ground, shot ricocheted up with brutal force, spraying lead into soft bodies. Attacking the center in force, Makonnen's men formed inviting targets for shrapnel and suffered heavy casualties, the heaviest of the day. A little before 10, a third column of some 15,000 men, Tigrayans under the command of Mangasha and Alula, attacked the Italian right. Makonnen's battle plan, which applied pressure first to the Italian left, then to the center, then to the right, aimed at rolling up Tosali's forces. Besides being a brilliantly simple plan and correspondingly easy to execute, it represented a significant departure from standard Ethiopian attack tactics, which typically sought envelopment by pressuring right and left flanks simultaneously. By rolling from Italian left to right, Makonnen broke Tosali's contact with his preferred line of retreat north to Magale and his most likely path of reinforcement. The sheer imbalances of forces, Toselli had 4 cannon and perhaps 2,000 soldiers, a mere handful of men against Makonnen's 40,000, left little doubt about the outcome. In the end, Toselli could only cling to the illusory hope that General Arimondi would arrive with reinforcements before his forces were wiped out. In the meantime, Toselli resolved to make the Ethiopians pay for every foot of terrain. The rugged topography of the Amba meant that the Ethiopians would have to endure very high casualties to reach the Italian positions. Ethiopian troops clambered up the steep slopes, and those who survived the climb pressed on against Italian artillery positions, taking horrific casualties as the Italians fired shot at 50 paces. The carnage was unspeakable. By 12:30, Toselli had despaired for reinforcement. He had to think about retreat. He shifted 2 artillery batteries to reinforce his right to protect his only remaining path of retreat, but the advantage of terrain shifted in retreat. Moving soldiers and material was a challenge where men and mules could move only in single file. A man who fell in retreat blocked the path completely. A false step could lead to a fall of 1,000 feet. As Toselli's men took aim to cover their retreat, the bodies of mules served as impromptu redoubts. When the situation grew more desperate, artillery pieces were pitched down and hillside rather than left to be captured. In some cases, men threw themselves after. The tangle of guns, mules, and men became treacherous. One Eritrean soldier watched as a mule crumpled, hit by bullet. The animal tumbled to the valley below, taking Lieutenant Marzio Manfredini and part of an artillery piece with him. By 1 in the afternoon, the fighting was over. The retreat turned into a massacre. Soldiers scrambled, trampling the fallen as they raced northward in panicked flight. Ethiopian pursuers picked off stragglers. When the chase broke off, villagers took over, harassing the retreating men and stripping the fallen. Amba Alage, the turning point. For Italy and its allies, Amba Alage would be a story of heroism, starting with Toselli himself, who enjoyed a kind of secular canonization following his death. Illustrations depicted Toselli at the moment of his death, at the center of a swarm of Ethiopians, being crowned in laurel by an angelic figure as his body rose heavenward, an apotheosis. A singable tune, Toselli's song, enjoyed a modest popularity, at least in military circles. And indeed, by all accounts, Toselli had fought bravely in a desperate situation, covering the retreat of his men until he himself was taken down. Gabra Iyasus, one of the better contemporary Ethiopian observers, noted that Major Toselli never looked back. In other words, he never considered retreat for himself and fought like a lion, parrying blows like a hero, without tiring until he fell where he stood. Ras Makonnen made sure that Toselli's body was recovered and properly buried, a gesture of profound respect. Newspapers in Germany and Austria dutifully respected the sentiments of their Italian ally. The story of Amba Alage was the story of a hero. The French press, antagonistic toward Italy and especially toward Italy's Francophobic Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, didn't bother to conceal its sympathy for Menelik. In Italy itself, Amba Alage revealed popular ambivalence about Italy's colonial enterprise. Italians certainly were moved by the tragic death at Amba Alage. In fact, the sentiments the defeat inspired, a desire for revenge and the retrieval of Italy's honor, were leveraged in the Chamber of Deputies into approval for additional funding for Ertra. Still, the purpose of the Italian presence in East Africa was not clearer and the cause no more popular. Corriere della Sera, the leading Italian newspaper, felt vindicated in its criticisms of the government's colonial adventure. Meanwhile, students at the University of Rome suspicious of militarism and colonialism, chanted "Viva Minilik" to the horror of patriotic commentators. It may well have been Europe's first anti-colonial demonstration. For Ethiopia, the story of AMBW was a story of triumph and confidence, a critical interim step that would culminate in victory at Adwa. After all, the speed with which Mangasha had been defeated just a few months earlier had raised doubts about Ethiopian effectiveness against European forces. These doubts were dramatically erased when the news of AMBW reached the main Ethiopian force at Alamata, more than 50 miles to the south. In the feat reminiscent of Marathon, one of Mangasha's men had run all night after the battle, reaching Alamata just as Minilik's army was breaking camp. As the messenger scrambled down the hillside, soldiers pressed around him. "Where are you from?" the men asked. "Give us news." "I'm sent by the Ras Mangasha," he gasped. "I bear a letter. The Italian army at Alage is annihilated. Their cannon and rifles are at our hands." "Pity on us," the soldiers cried in mock disappointment. "Have we come all this way without a chance to fight?" At AMBW, the Italians had done Ethiopia an enormous favor by putting a smaller, beatable force in harm's way. However imbalanced the conflict, Ethiopian victory at AMBW showed that the Italians could be defeated, and defeated decisively. This paid dividends as local chiefs, some of whom had wavered in their support, now rallied to Minilik. At his new camp at Wafla, Minilik received several local chiefs who previously had hesitated, unsure whom to back. Now they pledged their loyalty and agreed to join the Ethiopian army with their men at Mekelle. Even Tekle Haimanot, who had vacillated, sent a force to Minilik after AMBW with the promise of more troops to follow. AMBW also showed that Ethiopia's princess, its Ras, could be trusted to overcome their differences in the name of Ethiopia. AMBW was the first time that soldiers from north and south, Tigray and Shoa, fought side by side, despite rival ambitions that had split Mangasha from Minilik and regional prejudices that made Tigrayans wary of Shoans. These men fought together as Ethiopians. In that sense, AMBW was a milestone in the creation of modern Ethiopia. As a national victory, it meant that personal, local, and regional interests and loyalties had to be recalibrated. Ethiopian particularisms didn't vanish, but they had to make way as national alliances were added to the mix. As Minilik and his army continued their march, minstrels proudly sang a verse mocking the Italians. "Oh wonders, they crossed the sea on a boat to conquer Ethiopia?" The minstrel's skeptical query captured the confidence and pride of the army. Did the Italians really think it was going to be that easy? And given that these troubles had started over the issue of a protectorate, it raised an obvious question. Who needs a protectorate when the protected can defeat the would-be protector? When the Ethiopians marched north from AMBW to pursue their war of independence, they marched with the swagger of winners. Fortifying Mekelle, the story of Tosali's glorious martyrdom, offered solace to the aggrieved, but it masked questions about military leadership and competency, starting with Baratieri himself. General Arimondi, the person most directly responsible for the disaster, shifted attention from himself by taking his disagreements with Baratieri public, feeding the Italian press with information that put Baratieri's judgment in doubt. Within weeks, critics asked publicly whether Tosali's men had died not with the thought that their sacrifice had been useful to the fatherland, but instead with the conviction that their death was the consequence of foreseeable errors. What kind of leader would put 2,000 men in such an exposed position, miles away from reinforcement? What kind of leader would fail to give orders or liberty of action in the face of unspeakable contingencies. Tassali's death may have been glorious by some standard, but if so, it was a tragic glory, the glory of men who died because of incompetence of other men. Italy now knew the full dimensions of the enemy it had conjured. Mobilization for the next confrontation began in earnest. Tassali's sacrifice inspired some volunteers in Italy to join the ranks, but in nothing near the numbers the Italian leadership now knew it needed. What patriotism couldn't provide, chance and duty would. The army created a lottery, a kind of random tax on existing units, plucking the men it needed from those already in uniform to create 14 battalions. These newly amalgamated units, 40,000 men in all, began to ship out from Naples within days of the news of the disaster. Between December 16th and January 5th, 11 steamships provided by the pro-Africanist Rubatino Shipping Company departed from Massawa. A second round of reinforcements began shipping out on January 12th and extended through February 1st, sending tons of equipment and supplies along with an additional 6,500 soldiers. Ambalage was just the first stop in Minilik's campaign to restore Ethiopian sovereignty. 35 miles to the north, the Italians had established a fortified position at Megale. General Arimondi chose to evacuate most of his forces following the defeat at Ambalage, rather than allow them to be entrapped at Megale. But in the end, he decided that the outright abandonment of Megale was out of the question. It had certain symbolic importance. It was said that once the Italian flag flew over the fortress, it could never be abandoned. But it had military significance too, with the goal of slowing the northward progress of Minilik's army. The thankless task of defending Megale had been given to Major Giuseppe Galliano. As Baratieri scrambled to build up his forces, Galliano's assignment and that of 1,200 men he commanded would be to buy time. Long before the Emperor's red tent went up outside Megale, Galliano's soldiers understood the challenge facing them. In the late morning of December 7th, the men at Megale had seen smoke spewing from Ambalage, 30 miles distance. As the crow flies, fighting had begun. Then the smoke stopped. Had Toseli and his men turned back the Ethiopian attack? There was no word. Shortly after midnight, the quiet of the night was broken by wailing of women, the spouses of the Askari signaling grief as the first stragglers from Ambalage arrived at Megale, bearing witness to the extent of the disaster. Dead, all dead, the survivors gasped. Majors, captains, lieutenants, all dead, everyone, everyone. For an hour, wounded soldiers stumbled out of the night into the torchlight, safe at last in the fortress at Megale. As the stream of survivors trailed off and the hope of more faded, sobbing women clawed at their faces and dragged rough stones across their skin in a bloody display of sorrow. Others pulled at their hair. Some sobbed as they crawled along the ground, faces buried in the earth. Dust mingled with streams of blood and tears, fashioning lives masks of grief. Fashioning living masks of grief. Many of the survivors were clad only in rags, a few were naked, victims of civilians who had preyed on them, stripping them of weapons and clothing. Some had been castrated, including one who boasted that it had taken 8 men to restrain him, arms and legs splayed. The hands are still good, he bellowed. When I am healed, I want to mow down all the Abyssinians. Megale was a city of some importance, having been the imperial capital during the reign of Johannes. For much of the month of December 1895, Italian forces had built up defenses. A church was converted into an ammunition depot. Italian soldiers and their Ascari recruits sang Italian songs as they reinforced the 230-foot-long wall that would be their main defense. When they were done, the walls of the Presidio were substantial, 6 feet thick at the top and some 16 feet at the bottom. Ethiopian light artillery would have a hard time breaching them. The defenders' hope was that the Ethiopian officers would send wave after wave of infantry in an effort to take the fort by sheer numbers. An Ethiopian infantry assault would allow Italian artillery to do its work. The Italians prepared for such a conflict in minute detail. They pulled down tukul near the fort that might provide cover for attackers and obstruct the line of sight for Italian artillery. They ran wire to establish a defensive perimeter outside the fort. Engineers dug deep trenches on either side of the main approach to the fort from the south. At the bottom of these 10-foot trenches, too deep to provide cover, they buried yard-long spikes at the 2-foot intervals. These would impale anyone falling in. The intent was to create a choke point. Ethiopian soldiers charging the fort from the south would be forced to converge on the road in order to bypass the spiked trenches. As they did so, they would make ripe, compact targets for eager Italian fire. Any soldiers who survived to approach the walls of the fort would have to negotiate additional hazards. Ethiopian soldiers fight without shoes, so the Italians scattered broken glass and pottery shards. As the Ethiopians picked their way among the hazards, they would do so within range of Italian sharpshooters. A fort needs to be a self-sustaining facility, but rarely is. On December 9th, a company of men left the fort in search of food for the men and feed for the animals. What they discovered on their foray was that much of the local population had vanished. This may have been simple prudence in the face of requisitioning force, or more ominously, a vote of no confidence in the future of the Italian occupation. Either way, it made the work of the troops more difficult. Instead of persuading local peasants to trade, sell, or donate their goods, the soldiers were forced to discover where the peasants had stashed their food and feed. As these foraging missions went on, the radius of their operations had to increase. Eventually, these forays extended 6 miles from the fort. There were other ominous signs as well. Communications with the North had become tenuous. After AMBW, the local population turned hostile. Couriers traveling by day were accosted. Only mail carried by night could get through. Italian spirits were kept up by daily rations of wine, coffee, and rum. Cigars had loose tobacco were also available for the Ethiopian soldiers. Nerves and drink led to some boasting among these soldiers about how they would dispose of Ethiopians when they arrived. "Come, Abyssinians, we'll help you find the road to hell," boomed one. At night, European officers gathered of what often turned into extended bouts of drinking. Flasks of Chianti and bottles of Barbera rolled under the table, noted one officer. "Long live Italy, long live the king, long live Major Galliano, long live Major Toselli." Major Galliano filed a rosy report with General Baratieri. "Morale is as high as can be." The mood changed dramatically on December 19th. Mekelle sits in a high-altitude basin several miles across, dominated by surrounding heights. Around 10 in the morning, a great dust cloud appeared in the southeast edge of the basin, where the heights descended into the plain. As the cloud approached, its base took the shape of an enormous column of men on foot and on horseback. It was the army of Ras Mekonnen, fresh from its victory at AMBW. Mekonnen's forces set up camp to the northeast of Mekelle, occupying a high position relative to the fort. Their position also put them between Mekelle and the main route north to Ertera. There would be no evacuation of the fort and no rescue that didn't go through Mekonnen. 2 days after his arrival, Mekonnen wrote to Major Galliano, the Italian commander of the Mekelle Presidio. Despite the imposing forces and his command and their dominant position, his tone was almost apologetic. Still, the objective was unmistakable. "How are you?" he wrote to Galliano. "I am well, thanks to God. Are your soldiers well? Mine are very well. In the name of my emperor, I pray you leave this land, otherwise I will be forced to make war. It pains me to have shed the blood of Christians. Please leave with your soldiers. Your friend, Mekonnen." Major Giuseppe Galliano, known by the whimsical name Pinotto to his family and friends, was skeptical of Mekonnen's peace overtures. He believed that Mekonnen was stalling, buying time until Menelik could arrive with the artillery that was critical to an assault on the fort. Galliano was somewhat skeptical about claims that Menelik was right behind Mekonnen, at the head of tens of thousands of additional troops. He took comfort in a commonplace among some northern Ethiopians that Menelik would never risk his crown for Tigray. Galliano was equally skeptical of rumors that Menelik's artillery would be carried by African elephants. Menelik, Galliano observed, like the elephants, never seemed to arrive. Galliano responded to Mekonnen's letter in mock sincere tones. "To His Highness Ras Mekonnen, commander of the Shoan advance guard from the commander of the fort at Mekelle. How are you? I am well, thanks be to God. My soldiers are very well, as I hope yours are too. My king has ordered me to remain here, and I will not move. Do what you have to do. I assure you that I have fine rifles and very fine cannon. Your friend Galliano." A second set of letters was exchanged on the 25th, but the results were no different. The signs were not all ominous, however. On December 30th, one of Ras Mekonnen's soldiers appeared outside the fort bearing a white flag and a third letter for Mekonnen. From Mekonnen. Mekonnen was asking for medical help for some of the men wounded in the battle at AMBW. Galliano complied, sending Lieutenant Mozetti, a physician, who spent a day in the Ethiopian camp caring for wounded soldiers. Later, Mozetti returned, accompanied by an Ethiopian escorting force commanded by Ato Georgios. While Mozetti provided Galliano with first-hand information about the size and battle readiness of Mekonnen's forces, the Italian kitchen crew plied Ato Georgios with food and drink. Generous quantities of brandy made Georgios chatty, and in the course of conversation, he revealed that Menelik would arrive shortly, augmenting Mekonnen's forces with some 100,000 of his own. If accurate, this meant the Ethiopian forces would total 125,000 and confirmed the higher estimate of the size of Menelik's army. As the brandy took hold, and before drifting off to sleep in the Italian fort, Georgios assured his hosts that Menelik had artillery and that his aim was to enjoy a drink in the governor's palace at Mazawa. In other words, Menelik's goal was to drive Italy not only from Tigray, but also from Africa entirely. Days passed without an attack from Ras Makonnen, feeding speculation that Makonnen, as a friend of Italy, would not attack. Meanwhile, the Askari took comfort from the fact that the flag flying over the fort at Mekelle fluttered to the north, an auspicious sign, helped along by the prevailing winds. More ominous, surely, was the fact that Makonnen's forces were completing their occupation of the high ground surrounding Mekelle. By January 1st, the encirclement was complete. In a defiant gesture that showed a wicked sense of humor, the defenders suspended a banner from the wall of the fort. On it was a jolly seasonal greeting, 1896, Bon anno. Even with humor intact, Galliano and his men were running out of options. Galliano ordered the destruction of the remaining houses and huts surrounding the fort. Squads of men worked their way through the settlements. Whatever couldn't be hauled to the fort was torched. The burning went on for 2 days. The gentlemanly exchange of messages and envoys ended. Makonnen's message of January 3rd was both blunt and grimly comic. Remember Amba Alage and Tosali's end. Give me the fort. Don't waste any more blood. I will escort you to Massawa and send along your bags too. A kind of epiphany. On January 6th, Galliano duly observed the Christian feast of the Epiphany in his journal, but the day brought a military epiphany as well. Numerous columns descended from the passes into the valley opposite the fort, and a kind of review. The emperor had arrived, but the review was as much for Galliano's benefit, to cure his skepticism by displaying the might of the Ethiopian army. Inside the fort at Mekelle, murmurs of it's the Nugus rose from all sides. Menelik's red tent went up to the northwest of the fort, just outside the range of the Italian artillery. That night, campfires rimmed the Mekelle basin. Clusters of fires to the east and west gave off an ardent, imposing glow that streamed down the hillsides into the plain. The next morning, a new supply of provisions arrived from Taitu's properties: butter, a great quantity of cattle, and 500 sheep. Taitu had this providential bounty distributed to the army, a sign of her readiness to persevere until victory. The siege of Mekelle, properly speaking, had begun. Very quickly, the confident mood in the fort took a sober turn. The Italians had established 2 observation posts outside the fort. Both of these fell to the Ethiopians following skirmishes in the 7th. The rapidity with which they succumbed surprised the Italians. Just the same, the Ethiopians suffered significant casualties in the fight. Taitu, Mangasha, Alula, even Menelik himself, unbraided Makonnen for not having attacked as soon as he arrived, before the fortifications were complete. Makonnen had wasted time in negotiations that produced nothing. There were murmured accusations of treason. Makonnen would pay the price for his delay. His men would have to lead the assault on the fort. On the 8th, Ethiopian artillery pounded the fort all day in hopes of opening a breach, without success. The Ethiopian quick-firing Hotchkiss batteries had better range than the Italian artillery, but their smaller caliber had little effect on the walls of Mekelle's fortress. Still, Galliano was impressed by the effectiveness of the fire from the 12 artillery pieces. 12 of them, Italian guns seized at Amba-Alage, that the Ethiopians trained on the fort. The Ethiopian artillerymen had mastered the art of correcting their aim after watching each shot fall. Long, short, then just right, noted one of the Italian artillerymen admiringly. The aim of the Ethiopian batteries was so precise that Galliano became convinced that they were not operated by Ethiopian soldiers. It's impossible that they're not European, he insisted. On the 9th, Makonnen's forces launched a major assault on the fort, taking heavy casualties. The loss of life pained Mekonnen, but the reaction of the Ethiopian leadership was pitiless. Taitu Minilik, Takla Haymanot, and Abuna Mateos, the last of these, the court's chaplain and ranking cleric, turned on Mekonnen and accused him of treason. "What do I have to do to prove my loyalty?" Mekonnen pleaded. After all, Mekonnen's soldiers were taking the heaviest losses. "You gave them time to build a fort," they answered. "It's up to you to take it down." Mekonnen threw his forces into the fight with renewed vigor. He ordered 3 attacks on the night of the 10th, the first shortly after midnight, the second at 2, and the third at 4 in the morning. Each time the Italians used flares to light up the night, and the attacks were repulsed. The next day, the 11th, Mekonnen's men prepared scaling ladders to be used to climb the walls. At 3 in the morning, the Ethiopians approached the fort under cover of darkness. They reached the walls apparently undetected, raised the ladders, and began to clamber up. The Italians were ready, however, withholding their fire until the last possible moment, when masses of Ethiopian soldiers gathered eagerly at the foot of the ladders. The effect of the opening volley was shattering, and dozens were killed. The rest wavered in confusion and panic. Many more fell in the fighting that followed. As stunned Ethiopian soldiers were picked off by soldiers firing from the walls of the fort. As the light of dawn rose on January 11th, more than 600 Ethiopian fighters lay dead beneath the walls of Mekelle. When news of the tragedy reached Mekonnen, he sought his own death by standing in full view of the fort, exposing himself to Italian fire. Ras Alula dashed over and forced him to take cover. Coming from Alula, a critic of Mekonnen, this was a redemptive gesture. That day, January 11th, represented the nadir of Menelik's march. It was the moment when everything might have unraveled. The frustrations at Mekelle were bringing out the worst in the Ethiopians. Rivalries, mistrust, suspect motives, and putting the army and the nation at risk. All of the goodwill of Menelik's subordinates, all of the confidence gained at AMBW, had been put in jeopardy by 1,000 men within the walls of Mekelle. Inside Menelik's tent, the mood was somber. Menelik and Mekonnen sat opposite each other. Tears streamed down their faces. Outside, across the camp, the wives of the fallen wailed in grief. The cries might just as well have been for Ethiopia itself. Menelik spoke. "Today is a very sad day for Ethiopia." Then they resumed their silence as the tormented cries washed over them. Finally, the 2 men stood. Menelik embraced Mekonnen, then turned to address the court in his characteristically laconic form, saying, "This is my faithful subject." It was a kind of absolution. There would be no more carping, no more recrimination. Menelik called off the attacks on the fort. Perhaps Mekelle would be taken without force. The great weakness of the Italian position was that the fort lacked an independent supply of water. There were 2 springs in the immediate vicinity, one to the north and another to the south, but neither was within the walls of the fort itself. The Italians had constructed a covered passageway to the closer of the 2 springs, offering protection from snipers, but the fundamental problem remained. Once the fort's water supply was taken, it would be very difficult to win back. In their frantic preparations for the arrival of Menelik's army, Galliano's soldiers had sought to address this weakness by constructing improvised cisterns. Captain Torquato Benucci supervised the excavation of 2 large pits, each capable of holding about 13,000 gallons within the fort walls. Waterproof tarpaulins were laid in the pits. For weak soldiers using empty wine casks, shuttled water from the springs to the reservoirs. They also ransacked the vacated homes of Mekelle, seizing clay bottles and pots used to hold tej, tella, beer from barley, and grain. The pots were filled with water and added to the fort's stores. A strict daily water ration allowed about 5 quarts of water a day for mules and horses, 2 for officers and 1 for ordinary soldiers. It's not clear who among the Ethiopians thought to target the Italian water supply. One source, the official Ethiopian Chronicle, credits Empress Aitu herself. On January 8th, Ethiopian troops seized both the springs, establishing the circumstances that would eventually force the Italians to capitulate. Water rations had to be cut almost entirely, with an exception made for the animals and the askari who used the water for the making of bread. In a move that undoubtedly improved morale, at least in the short term, a wine ration took the place of water for the Italian soldiers. But the overall situation was bleak. The Ethiopians had control of the springs, and the Italians were unable to do anything about it. At the same time, the Ethiopians moved up their artillery pieces. With their surprisingly accurate fire, that they were able to prevent the Italians from leaving the fort at all for any purpose. Given that the range of the Ethiopian guns was greater than that of the Italian artillery, the Italians had no effective response to the Ethiopian gunners. As the Ethiopians moved closer to the fort, they dug trenches to consolidate their gains. Under the cover of darkness, Ethiopian infantrymen could advance as far as the wire perimeter. From there, they would shout to the askari, alternately encouraging them to defect and threatening them with terrible reprisals should they fight and lose. For the men in the fort, thirst became an equally formidable enemy. As of January 13th, water rations were down to less than a quart per soldier per day. Even at that miserly rate, the fort would fall one way or another by the 21st. The quality of the water deteriorated as the reservoirs became muddy habitats for insects and moss. By the 17th, each soldier was receiving just 2 cups of polluted water. The defenders of Mekelle had turned back 5 attacks on the fort, but their situation was becoming desperate. The cherished illusion, of course, was that one day the defenders of Mekelle would hear the sound of cannon fire coming from the north, announcing their rescue. It was an illusion shared by Galliano himself, suggesting that he had only a vague notion of his true predicament. Rescue for Galliano and the Italian fort at Mekelle was out of the question. It would have taken tens of thousands of men to challenge Menelik's army, and no such force was available. When Baratieri arrived on Adigrat on January 9th, he had 2 battalions. To these he could add the forces under command of General Arimondi, as well as reinforcements moving up from Massawa. In all, he had some 10,000 men under his command. This meant that Adigrat was secure, but any thought of rescue for Galliano and Mekelle would have been sheer folly. Must the nation resign itself to another December 7th? Corriere della Sera asked, referencing the date on which Tosali's forces had fallen at Amba-Alage. A repeat of Amba-Alage wasn't out of the question, but it was an outcome Baratieri wanted to avoid at all costs. Negotiation was the only way out. For Menelik, time was a factor too. He didn't have pressing water supply concerns, but an army of the size he had created had to move or die. A lengthy siege imposed hardships that went beyond declining morale. He needed to keep his army in motion or lose it to hunger and attrition. Devoured by the Lion of Judah. Italy dispatched Pietro Felter to negotiate an end to the siege. Felter was a merchant with long experience in Ethiopia, having first set foot there in 1881. He was known to all the principals at court, Taitu Minilik Makonnen. If he wasn't exactly a trusted figure, he was at least familiar. As the talks proceeded, Felter took Galliano with him to the Ethiopian camp to conclude the negotiations. When Felter entered Minilik's tent, he found the emperor much changed. In place of the amiable character he had come to know in Addis, he confronted a dark and serious man. The smallpox scars gave the emperor a hard, fierce look, a look now deepened by the stress of war. Galliano, who never before had been in the presence of the Lion of Judah, looked as if he thought he was about to be eaten. He might well have been. So many Ethiopians' lives had been lost at Mekelle that no one was more despised than Galliano. "Why did you bring this man into my presence?" Menelik asked. Felter adroitly reminded the emperor of the honor owed all men who fight heroically for their king. If one of Menelik's brave warriors were presented to the king of Italy, he would be received with full honors. Menelik paused, then whispered to one of his pages, who immediately left. He returned moments later, leading what Felter described as the most splendid mule I have ever seen. The mule was outfitted with a collar of solid silver. Without a doubt, the mule came from Menelik's own stables. "Dear Felter," Menelik began, "you know that we are a poor people. Yet this gift must surely satisfy your commander, Galliano." The emperor then covered his face, signaling the end of the audience. Galliano, who had uttered not a word, rode the mule back to Mekelle. On January 19th, Menelik and Felter reached an agreement. If Galliano and his men abandoned the fort, they could go free, taking their weapons, ammunition, baggage, provisions, women, children, and wounded. On January 20th, Galliano ordered the white flag of surrender raised over the fort at Mekelle. There were a few details to be worked out. Galliano's men would not immediately be free. They would travel under escorts of the Ethiopian army. In fact, the escort was welcome. There were enough spilled blood and resentment to make the exit of Galliano's soldiers from the fort a dicey affair, with scuffles and threats. Then there was the matter of transport. Galliano's men lacked adequate pack animals, so the Ethiopians loaned Galliano several hundred mules for the transport of their gear. It would later be revealed that the Italians had agreed to a hefty rental fee for the animals, 25,000 thalers to be precise, more than enough to buy them and then some. In effect, the Italians were paying, in the guise of a fee, a ransom of Galliano's men. The following day, the 21st, Galliano and his troops prepared to leave. After more than a month of hostilities, including 5 failed assaults on the fortress, tensions were high. As Galliano's men exited the fort, they marched between 2 parallel columns of Ethiopian soldiers, 2 flanking walls, as one experienced it. When the evacuation was complete, the yellow, green, and red pennants of Ethiopia were hoisted over the fort. The work of demolition began. Within hours, the fort at Mekelle was gone. When the news reached Italy, the reaction was one of relief and celebration. Italy had avoided another AMBW, another Dogali. "O brave young men, O heroic young men," the weekly Illustrazione Italiana commented. The news was greeted as if it were a victory. Major Galliano was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel. The foreign press was not so kind. In France, Le Petit Journal ran a full-page color political cartoon on its cover. It showed Francesco Crispi in military dress getting a black eye from Menelik. The cartoon was picked up by newspapers around the world. Italy's allies joined an orchestrated effort to save face. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany sent a telegram of congratulations to King Umberto, observing that Galliano and Baratieri were worthy successors to the ancient Romans. Wilhelm asked Umberto's permission to decorate Galliano with a medal The Kaiser claimed to experience a great joy when Umberto graciously consented. To be sure, Galliano had accomplished much with little. With barely 1,000 men, he had held the mighty Ethiopian army at bay. He had broken the elan of the Ethiopians in the aftermath of AMBW. He had bought time for Baratieri to bring up the reinforcements that were arriving daily from Italy, concentrating them at Adigrat. Menelik's northward march resumed on 22nd. With Galliano's men in custody, Mangesha's forces would take the lead, followed by Galliano and his men. While Makonnen and his soldiers served as rear guard, Menelik and the main Ethiopian army would follow at 3 hours' delay. By January 30th, it was evident that the safe passage of Galliano's forces fit into a larger plan. After Mekelle, there was nothing standing between Menelik, his army, and the forces Italy was concentrating frantically at Adigrat. A titanic confrontation loomed. Indeed, when Menelik left Mekelle, he proceeded as if he intended to march on Adigrat. He paused for 2 days at Agula in late January, but then he shifted his path toward the west, as if to bypass Adigrat. By January 29th, he was encamped at Hausen, on a route that would take him west to Adwa, rather than north to Adigrat. Menelik had absorbed the lesson of Mekelle. Attacking fortified positions was futile. Menelik had no intention of advancing on Adigrat. He was using Galliano's men as shields to protect his army as it completed a risky passing movement, exposing his flank to Baratieri's forces as he moved past Adigrat. Menelik's army would not be attacked as long as Galliano's troops were among them. Finally, on the 13th, Galliano's troops were released to rejoin Baratieri. Menelik held 10 officers, including Galliano, for a few more days for safekeeping. Menelik's movement, along with the careful use of his hostages, telegraphed his strategic plan. He would bypass Adigrat and seek to turn the Italian position by moving past it. All the while, he openly advertised his position and his willingness to negotiate a definitive peace. Moreover, with every step he gave the lie to Italian claims on Ethiopian territory. His northward march shredded Italian assertions of sovereignty in Tigray and shielded a delicate maneuver under the guise of an honor guard. It played well in Europe, where Menelik, always with an eye to international public opinion, could now add shrewd strategist to his reputation as a patient and peace-loving statesman. On the 5th of February, he sent Barambaras Emmanuel to Baratieri with the announcement that he had moved his court from Hausen to Gundapta, to the east of Adwa, where he would wait 5 days for an Italian envoy authorized to negotiate a peace treaty. Baratieri responded with a message that was either brazen bluff or proof of a tragic state of denial. With Menelik poised to march into Ertra with an army of more than 100,000, Baratieri, who might soon have 17,000 soldiers at his disposal, acted like a man holding all the cards. He sent Major Tommaso Salsa to Menelik with the message that he would accept negotiations on the basis of 2 conditions: reaffirmation of the Treaty of Wajale and recognition of the Italian occupation of the new territories. There was an admirable boldness in Baratieri's response, but it also antagonized the Ethiopian court. Aitu, on her brother Wele, and Tigrayans Alula and Mangasha were furious. Given the strategic realities, Menelik's reply was the picture of moderation. He would accept negotiations on the basis of 2 conditions: the return of the occupied territories and the complete modification of the Treaty of Wajale. Thanks to AMBW and Mekelle, the strategic balance was now in Ethiopia's favor. However, because of Ambalage and Megale, the pressure on Oreste Baratieri for a victory of some kind was stronger than ever. Italy had been maneuvered into a strategic corner. With little leverage to use in negotiations, Baratieri's options were down to two: military victory, which looked increasingly doubtful, or humiliating retreat.